The night, a German shepherd and a child saved the desert's forgotten. There are places the world forgets. Rusted Cross was one of them, a bridge abandoned when the roads changed, left to creak in the desert wind, sheltering only dust and shadows. Until one night, it sheltered 3 dying men. They were Marines, ambushed by a cartel contact who had promised cooperation, but delivered betrayal. Bound, gagged and bleeding, they lay beneath the iron bones of the bridge, listening to their own hearts slow in the freezing dark. But far away, a retired K9 stiffened. Shadow had lived long enough to know the difference between silence and danger. With a single sharp bark, he tore through the fence, running into the horizon. Emily, 9 years old, didn't hesitate. She had already lost her parents. She wouldn't lose him too. Grabbing her grandfather's medic satchel, she followed, her small frame swallowed by the desert night. What waited for them beneath that bridge was despair. What they brought instead was hope. This is not just a story about survival. It's about the way loyalty doesn't die with retirement, and how courage sometimes comes wrapped in small hands and 4 steady paws. The Arizona desert had a way of swallowing sound, as though the land itself wanted to forget. By day, it burned, a furnace of endless sand and red stone, where heat waves shimmered like ghosts across the horizon. By night, it turned merciless in another way, stealing warmth, stealing breath, leaving only the bones of silence behind. The bridge stood there, a skeleton against the fading sky. Once called Rusted Cross by the locals, it was nothing more than twisted girders and weathered bolts now, abandoned when the new highways carved a cleaner path through the canyons. The iron had grown a coat of rust like dried blood, each beam moaning faintly as the desert wind threaded through the gaps. Beneath it, the earth dipped into a shallow ravine, littered with brittle sagebrush and stones that cracked under the weight of time. Few in Silverton Hollow ever came here. Some said the place was cursed. Tonight, it was a grave waiting to be claimed. 3 figures lay bound in the shadows beneath the bridge. Their uniforms, torn and stained, marked them as U.S. Marines. Their lives at this moment hung by the thinnest of threads. Nathan Cole sat slumped against a girder, the gag in his mouth soaked with blood from a split lip. At 30, he carried the kind of face the desert carved, angular, sun-worn, with eyes that had once been sharp, but now fought to stay open. His left thigh burned with searing pain, where a knife or blunt object had torn through muscle. Blood seeped into the dust beneath him, spreading slowly, dark as oil in the dim light. Every shift of his body sent white fire up his side, but the nylon cords around his wrists and ankles were merciless, biting deeper the more he strained. To his left lay Ethan Morales, younger, wiry, and fast-thinking under normal circumstances. Now he was silent, except for the low, guttural sounds that escaped his throat each time he moved against the bindings. His right eye had swollen shut, the skin around it bruised purple and black. A deep gash split across his forehead. The blood dried in streaks along his temple. The desert chill had already started to make his body shiver, a cruel counterpoint to the heat they had endured only hours before. The third, Ryan Carter, had gone frighteningly still. His head rested against the packed clay, chest rising in shallow jerks. His sandy blonde hair was caked with dirt, his gag stained dark. Nathan's heart lurched each time Ryan's breathing faltered. He wanted to reach for him, shake him awake, but he could barely keep his own head from lolling forward. The bridge above them groaned again, iron lamenting in the cold. Nathan tried to force his mind to stay sharp, to focus, but the pain blurred the edges of thought. He closed his eyes, and fragments of memory flickered through like broken film reels. The mission, the lead that had brought them here. They had tracked cartel movements for weeks. Supply drops scattered across forgotten roads, hidden caches of weapons and drugs buried beneath desert brush. A network that bled across the border like a cancer. Their orders were simple: follow the trail, find the hub, gather intel. But nothing in the desert stayed simple. It had started with a contact, a man they believed could point them to the next drop. Nathan remembered the way the man had spoken, his words oily, his eyes shifting too much. Still, they'd followed. They'd trusted the tip. He had led them toward Rusted Cross, swearing the bridge was the meeting point. The first strike came fast, a blunt blow to the back of Nathan's skull. He had gone down hard, the taste of dirt and blood filling his mouth. Shadows moved out of nowhere, efficient, practiced. Ethan had shouted, Ryan had reached for his weapon, but there hadn't been time. A flurry of fists, boots, the plastic zip ties tightening until bones ached. Then silence. Nathan forced his eyes open again, trying to blink away the haze. The desert night pressed closer, cruel and uncaring. Above them, the stars began to pierce the last of the twilight, sharp, cold, indifferent. He thought of his sister, a fleeting image of her standing on their family's porch back home, waving when he shipped out for his last tour. He'd promised her then that he'd come back. Always. A Marine's oath wasn't just to his country, but to those who waited, those who trusted. And now, here, beneath this forgotten bridge, that promise felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Ethan let out a groan, low and guttural, snapping Nathan back. His friend tried to shift, muscles straining, but the cords held. Nathan could see the frustration in Ethan's dark eyes, the unspoken curse that he couldn't voice past the gag. Ryan, on the other hand, gave no response. Only the faint rise of his chest reassured Nathan that life hadn't left him yet. The wind cut through the ravine, sharp as a knife, carrying with it the scent of iron and dust. It whispered across the beams, rattling loose bolts, filling the silence with a sound that felt almost like laughter. The desert did not pity. It waited. Nathan tested the bindings again, his wrists raw, blood slick against the nylon. Nothing gave. His chest heaved, each breath a battle. His vision blurred at the edges, and he knew the cold was coming for them faster than the blood loss. He had seen men fall to hypothermia before. Slow, brittle deaths that crept in without mercy. Tonight, under Rusted Cross, that was their future. He leaned his head back against the girder, eyes fluttering closed for a moment. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he replayed the moment of betrayal. The smirk of the contact, the sound of boots in the dust, the sudden certainty that they had been delivered into a trap. Rage flared briefly in his chest, but it had no strength behind it. Only the bitter taste of failure. Hopelessness pressed down heavier than the iron above him. For the first time in years, Nathan felt the edge of despair gnawing at him. His sister's face blurred, his oath blurred. The night itself seemed to lean closer, promising nothing but silence. And then, faint, carried on the wind, he thought he heard it. A bark, sharp, urgent. His eyes snapped open, searching the darkness. Nothing but shadows, nothing but wind. The sound came again, or maybe it didn't. Maybe his mind was conjuring ghosts, giving him illusions to cling to as his body failed. He tried to focus, to listen, but the cold pressed harder, and his vision swam. Nathan let out a muffled breath against the gag, his eyelids too heavy to keep open. For a heartbeat, hope flickered like a match in the wind. A dog, a sound that didn't belong to the desert. Then the darkness surged again, pulling him under. Beneath the bridge called Rusted Cross, the night closed in, and 3 Marines hung on the razor's edge between life and death. The cords bit deeper with every twitch of muscle. Nathan Cole could feel the nylon grinding against raw skin, a burning ache layered over the deeper throb in his leg. He had tried to shift once more, but the effort sent fire up his thigh and left him gasping against the gag. For a Marine who had marched through dust storms in Kandahar and slept in rain-drenched foxholes, pain was no stranger. But this helplessness was a different kind of torment. His head drooped forward, the copper taste of blood heavy on his tongue. In the darkness, fragments of memory replayed themselves without mercy. The mission had begun with a promise, just a routine follow-up, a thread in a larger web they were weaving against the cartel. For months, intelligence reports had circled like vultures, caches hidden in old mine shafts, convoys slipping across the border under cover of night, shipments masked as agricultural deliveries. Each lead was a loose stitch, but together they hinted at a network bleeding poison into both sides of the desert. Nathan and his unit had been tasked with following one of those threads, a contact who claimed to know about a major drop near Silverton Hollow. Nathan remembered the man's voice clearly, too smooth, too eager. He had introduced himself as Alvarez, though Nathan doubted that was his real name. The man had leaned close in the dim light of a roadside diner, greasy hair falling into his eyes, fingers drumming the table as though keeping rhythm with some invisible clock. "You want to know where the goods move? Rusted Cross," Alvarez had said. "Tonight, midnight, they stash everything under that bridge. But you didn't hear it from me." Even then, alarms had flared in Nathan's mind. The way Alvarez never quite met his gaze. The twitch at the corner of his mouth when he mentioned the bridge. But they had been running dry on leads, and their orders were clear. Follow every trail until it ended, no matter how thin. They had gone in with caution. Weapons checked, radios on low. Ethan had joked as they geared up, his voice a quiet rasp in the back of the Humvee. "Figures. We chase ghosts through the desert, and it always leads to some creepy old landmark. Bet you $5 this bridge is haunted." Ryan had laughed, shaking his head, that easy grin breaking through the tension. Nathan had let himself smile too, if only for a second. But there had been no ghosts waiting at Rusted Cross, only men. The ambush had come swift, surgical, shapes in the dark, boots grinding gravel, the gleam of metal pipes under starlight. Nathan had barely swung his rifle up when a crushing blow landed against his temple, dropping him to one knee. The world spun, stars collapsing into streaks of white. He remembered Ethan shouting, the snap of a struggle, Ryan's grunt as someone drove a knee into his back. Hands grabbed him, forced him down. Plastic zip ties cut into his wrists before he could catch his breath. A fist slammed into his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. The last thing he saw before the gag cut off his words was Alvarez himself, standing just beyond the fray. That smirk curling his lips, the glint in his eyes that said it had been a game from the beginning. Nathan had roared against the gag, against the ties, but it was useless. The trap had been perfect. Now, hours later, he sat in the dirt under that same bridge, the betrayal replaying like a blade twisting in his mind. Ethan shifted beside him, a groan muffled by fabric. The sound was thick with pain, each breath hitching. Nathan turned his head slightly, catching the younger Marine's eyes in the dim light. There was frustration there, anger caged by the gag, but beneath it all, fear. Ethan had always been quick with analysis, sharp with pattern recognition. He knew the odds as well as Nathan did. Bound, bleeding, abandoned. The desert didn't give second chances. Ryan was worse. His chest rose shallowly, his head lolling to the side with every shiver. Nathan's stomach tightened each time Ryan's breath paused too long. He wanted to shout, to call his name, but the gag reduced him to desperate, muffled sounds. He willed Ryan to hear him anyway, to stay tethered to life by sheer force of brotherhood. The desert wind pushed through again, curling around their bodies with icy fingers. It carried grit into Nathan's eyes, stung the open wounds on his face. Somewhere above, the bridge groaned like a dying animal. The sound merged with the pulse in his ears, until he could no longer tell which belonged to the steel and which to his own failing body. He thought of his sister again, the porch light back home, warm against the Carolina night. She had been 14 the last time he saw her, hair tied back, eyes bright with worry she tried to hide. "Promise me, Nate. Promise you'll come back." And he had. With the conviction only a Marine could carry, he had sworn it. He had survived firefights, IED blasts, nights when mortars fell like rain. Each time, he had held on to that vow like armor. But what good was an oath beneath a rusting bridge in the middle of nowhere, with death closing in by inches? Nathan clenched his fists until the cords cut deeper, pain shooting up his arms. He refused to let go of that promise, not yet, not until the last breath left his chest. But the truth pressed heavy. They had been deceived, dismantled, discarded. The cartel wouldn't come back for them. Why waste the effort when the desert would finish the job for free? In a few hours, maybe less, the cold would claim Ryan first, then Ethan, then himself. The headlines would never read their names. Their mission would vanish into silence. Hopelessness seeped in, cold as the sand beneath him. He looked at Ethan again, then Ryan, and felt the weight of command, of failing the men who trusted him. His throat worked against the gag, a sound escaping that was half growl, half prayer. Above them, the stars glittered indifferently. The universe stretched wide, endless, beautiful, and utterly uncaring. Nathan let his head drop back against the iron girder, eyes burning, breath clouding in the freezing air. They had been betrayed. They had been left, and now, bound beneath Rusted Cross, they were waiting for death to arrive. The desert had shifted. Hours earlier, the heat had clung to everything, pressing down like a fist, forcing sweat from skin and dust into lungs. But now, the furnace has become a tomb. Cold came creeping in from every shadow, sharp and merciless. It slithered across the ravine floor, wrapped around a broken sagebrush, and seeped through the thin fabric of fatigues like water, finding cracks in stone. The desert at night was not simply absence of warmth. It was an assassin, patient and exact. Wind ghosted through the hollow girders of Rusted Cross, carrying with it the faint tang of iron and the brittle scent of mesquite. It moved like whispers, like voices too low to understand, curling around the steel beams until the whole bridge seemed to murmur with secrets. The iron itself groaned, long and low, as though it remembered the weight of trains it no longer carried. Against that ancient metal, the three men beneath it seemed impossibly fragile, flesh and bone trembling against a structure built to outlast them. Nathan Cole shifted, or tried to. The effort sent knives of pain through his thigh, and he fell still again, chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. His wrists throbbed where nylon cords had bitten raw, every heartbeat another reminder that he was bleeding time. The cold wrapped around him like chains, and he knew the signs. He'd seen hypothermia take men in the mountains of Afghanistan. The first shivers gave way to numbness, then to the illusion of warmth. until men lay down in the snow and never rose again. That creeping quiet was here now, coiling through his limbs, whispering that rest would be easier than fighting. Beside him, Ethan Morales groaned again. The sound was soft, muffled by his gag, but sharp enough to cut through Nathan's fog. His younger brother-in-arms shivered violently, his breath hitching, head jerking against the cord, biting into his shoulders. Each spasm of movement seemed to sap more of his strength, leaving him trembling like a frayed wire. Ryan Carter was nearly gone. His breathing had thinned to a fragile thread, chest barely lifting. His head lolled sideways, blonde hair damp with sweat and grit. Nathan's gaze lingered on him, fear tightening his chest. If Ryan slipped under now, there would be no pulling him back. The wind rose again, rattling the bridge above them. It howled against the beams, then softened into eerie sighs as it curled through gaps in the iron. The sound reminded Nathan of cathedrals, of standing in silence before something ancient, vast, and uncaring. He had always believed steel was unbreakable, forged to withstand storms, bullets, time itself. Yet even here, rust had eaten into the bridge, holes pockmarking its skeleton, strength eroded, foundations forgotten. Was that not what they were now? Once soldiers, once sharp, now eroded under the relentless weather of betrayal and neglect. His mind drifted, slipping between clarity and haze. He thought of his sister again, her laughter carrying across a Carolina porch, her small hand clutching his sleeve when he first left for boot camp. He had carried that image through firefights, through desert patrols, through nights when mortars shook the earth. That memory had always been an anchor, keeping him steady when chaos threatened to drag him under. But now, even her face blurred at the edges, like a photo left too long in the sun. Nathan forced his eyes open, fixing on the stars. They pierced the sky with cruel beauty, thousands of them spread like shattered glass across black velvet, each one burning with a light that would outlast him by eons. It humbled him, infuriated him. The universe didn't care about promises, about oaths whispered on porches or in foxholes. Out here, men died, and the stars kept shining, cold and bright. Ethan let out another muffled groan, this one weaker. Nathan turned his head, lips pressing against the gag in a futile attempt to form words. He wanted to tell him to hold on, to remind him that Marines didn't quit, that their fight wasn't finished. But all that came out was a strangled sound, swallowed by the desert. The cold crept deeper, settling into Nathan's chest. His breathing slowed, each inhale harder to draw. He knew the stages, first the shivers, then the stillness. Already his body trembled less. Already the pain in his leg dulled, replaced by an insidious numbness that felt like relief, but meant death. He fought to keep his eyes open, but the weight of them grew heavier with every passing second. Wind whipped through the girders again, high and mournful. It carried with it a sound that did not belong, a bark. Nathan's eyes snapped open. His heart stumbled against his ribs. He held his breath, straining to hear over the wind. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the moan of iron, the whisper of sand. He thought maybe his mind had conjured it, another cruel trick of a body slipping toward oblivion. But then it came again, sharp, urgent, alive. A dog's bark, carried faint but clear through the ravine. Hope flared, wild and irrational. His heart hammered, adrenaline surging against the tide of numbness. He tried to push himself upright to see, but his body betrayed him, refusing to move. His head fell back against the girder with a hollow thud. Still, he clung to the sound, desperate, ears straining for another bark, Nothing followed. Only silence. Only wind. Nathan let out a shuddering breath, chest tight with both relief and despair. Maybe it had been real. Maybe not. Out here, in the endless desert night, even hope sounded like hallucination. His vision swam again, stars blurring into streaks above. The last thing he clung to before darkness pulled him under was that sound, the echo of a bark against the iron bones of Rusted Cross. And in that fleeting heartbeat, Nathan Cole let himself believe, if only for a moment, that maybe the desert hadn't abandoned them entirely. Silverton Hollow was the kind of place that seemed to exist only because the desert had forgotten to swallow it whole. A single stretch of asphalt cut through the middle, cracked and faded, its yellow lines long since bleached to white by the sun. Dust clung to everything, the windows, the rooftops, the porch rails, as though the town had been wrapped in a thin, unshakable film of time. On the corner sat a gas station, its neon sign buzzing faintly, flickering in tired pulses of red and green. Half the letters no longer lit, so that at night it read more like a riddle than a name. Inside, 2 humming refrigerators struggled against the heat, rattling like old men trying to catch their breath. Just beyond it, a row of storefronts slumped in silence. A laundromat, a diner, a hardware store with a bell above the door that hadn't chimed in weeks. Most of the locals kept to themselves, faces worn by sun and years. Life in Silverton Hollow was not measured in ambition or progress, but in survival. Cattle tended, water hauled, fences mended. People left if they could. Those who stayed were bound by something quieter, obligation, memory, or a simple refusal to let the desert win. It was in this town, in a stucco house near the edge of the road, where the pavement surrendered to sand, that Emily Walker lived. She was 9 years old, slight for her age, her frame delicate but wiry with the stubborn energy of a child who refused to yield to loss. Her hair was a wild chestnut tangle, often braided clumsily into 2 strands that fell over her shoulders, each one fraying by the end of the day. Freckles dusted her cheeks, standing out against skin that burned too easily under the Arizona sun. But it was her eyes that marked her, almond-shaped and green, clear as glass. They held a kind of quiet that was unusual for a child, a depth shaped less by years than by grief. 2 summers ago, Emily had lost her parents in a car accident along the desert highway. Since then, she had lived with her grandfather, Samuel Walker. The world had grown smaller for her, but sharper too. Where other children saw only surface, Emily noticed the in-between spaces, the slant of light across the sand, the way silence carried, the tremor in a person's hand that told more than their words. Her constant companion was a German shepherd named Shadow. He was 7 years old, his coat a mixture of sable and black that caught the sun in ripples of bronze. His left hind leg bore the memory of an old injury, a gunshot wound from his years as a Border Patrol K-9. The scar ran along his flank, and though he walked with a faint limp, there was nothing weak in his bearing. Shadow moved with the deliberate precision of a soldier, every turn of his head measured, every glance sharp. Yet when he rested, it was with a gentleness that seemed almost human, curling beside Emily with a sigh, his amber eyes soft, ears twitching at her smallest movements. In Silverton Hollow, the pair had become an unspoken fixture. Neighbors would see them at dawn, walking barefoot along the dirt roads, Emily with her sketchbook tucked under her arm, Shadow pacing beside her like a sentinel. At the diner, he would wait by the door, patient, until she emerged with a biscuit tucked into her pocket, just for him. At night, when the wind rattled the windows, he would curl at the foot of her bed, his body forming a shield between her and the world. To Emily, Shadow was more than a dog. He was proof that even broken things could still carry dignity. She had watched the way he bore his limp, not as a weakness, but as a scar turned into a story. In him, she saw a mirror of herself, marked by loss, but still standing, still moving forward, still listening for what the world had to say. That afternoon, the town seemed to hold its breath. Heat shimmered above the asphalt, turning the horizon into a wavering mirage. The only sounds were the steady hum of cicadas and the occasional groan of an old truck passing through. Emily sat cross-legged on the front porch of the stucco house, her pencil moving across the pages of her sketchbook. She liked to draw the desert, not the broad sweeps of it, but the details others overlooked. The curve of a lizard's tail, the brittle veins in a mesquite leaf, the way the bridge at the edge of town stood against the sky like an old scar. Shadow lay a few feet away, his body stretched in the patch of shade cast by the porch post. His ears flicked lazily at the sound of flies, but his eyes remained on Emily, watching, guarding, always. He was never far. The people of Silverton Hollow often said the desert had a language of its own, one that most forgot how to hear. Emily hadn't forgotten. Shadow had taught her how to listen, to the silence, to the small shifts that spoke louder than noise. She had learned how to trust the way his ears stiffened before a storm, how his body tensed when something unseen moved at the edge of the horizon. She glanced at him now, and for a moment she thought she saw it, that subtle change, the faint tightening in his shoulders. But it passed as quickly as it came, and Shadow let out a slow exhale, laying his head against his paws again. Emily returned to her sketch, her pencil scratching across the paper. The sun dipped lower, staining the desert gold, and the neon sign at the gas station flickered to life, buzzing in stubborn defiance of the dusk. Another night was coming, and with it, the desert would change again, from furnace to blade, from days' cruelty to nights. Inside the house, Samuel Walker moved quietly, his radio crackling with static as he adjusted the dial, searching for the weather report. His voice, low and steady, drifted through the screen door. "Storm winds out west. We'll see them by morning." Emily didn't look up from her sketch, but she heard him. She always heard him. Her grandfather's voice was like bedrock, worn, reliable, carrying a weight that kept her steady even when the world felt brittle. On the porch, Shadow's ears twitched again, this time sharper, quicker. He lifted his head, nose tilting slightly toward the horizon. Emily noticed. Her pencil stilled, but that was not yet. Not tonight. For now, Silverton Hollow lay quiet beneath the wide desert sky, a town forgotten by the world, a girl marked by grief, and a German shepherd whose scar carried as much story as his eyes. Together, they waited for something they could not yet name. The Walker house smelled faintly of liniment and cedar, the scents woven into every corner by years of habit and work. In the kitchen, jars of salves lined the shelves beside tins of tea, and a heavy wooden table sat scarred from decades of use. Nicks from knife blades, burn marks from hot pans, gouges where Samuel Walker's hands had once pressed too hard in anger or grief. It was not a beautiful house, but it was steady, like its owner. Samuel moved slowly these days. At 67, he carried himself with the wiry frame of a man who had spent a lifetime in hard places, his joints stiffened by cold nights in tents and long days crouched over wounded men. His hair had long since turned white, trimmed close around ears that had heard too many battlefield cries. His beard was neatly kept, though it still curled in stubborn tufts near his chin. His eyes, blue-gray sharp beneath thick brows, were the one thing time had not dulled. They missed nothing. Once, he had been a military field medic, patching soldiers in jungles, in deserts, in places where the ground itself seemed to bleed. He had learned how to keep his hands steady when everything else shook. Later, when the wars were behind him, he had returned to Silverton Hollow and built a quieter life as the town's veterinarian. Dogs, cattle, horses. They didn't shout in pain the way soldiers did, but their eyes told the same story. He'd spent his years mending what he could, knowing that healing was never about perfection. It was about giving life another chance. When his daughter and her husband died on the highway 2 summers ago, Samuel's world contracted again. He found himself holding a small girl who had lost more than anyone her age should. Emily had clung to him then, her small fingers gripping his shirt, her silent sobs pressing against his chest. From that night forward, his mission had changed. No longer patching soldiers, no longer saving strays. Now he was to keep this one child steady in a world that had turned too cruel, too fast. He did not smother her with words. Samuel was not built for speeches or empty comforts. Instead, he taught. He showed her how to use her hands to bind a wound, how to breathe slowly when fear rose too high, how to trust silence when words failed. Fear, he had told her once, his hands demonstrating how to wrap gauze around her small wrist, is like a wound. If you leave it open, it festers. But if you patch it, if you tend it, you can keep moving. You don't let it bleed you out. Emily had listened. Always. She carried his lessons like seeds, planting them in the quiet places of her mind. That afternoon, in the small yard behind their house, she crouched beside an old rabbit hutch that Samuel had converted into a temporary shelter for the injured animals townsfolk sometimes brought him. Inside, a desert sparrow flapped weakly, one wing bent awkwardly. Emily's small hands moved with surprising gentleness as she laid strips of cloth on the workbench. Shadow sat nearby, his head tilted, watching with the intensity of a sentry. "Hold still," Emily whispered to the bird, though she knew it couldn't understand. She slid her hands carefully around its trembling body, her fingers steady, her breath slow, just as her grandfather had taught her. The sparrow struggled once, then quieted, heart fluttering against her palm like a clock running too fast. Samuel stood in the doorway of the workshop, arms folded across his chest, his weathered face unreadable. He watched as Emily aligned the wing, adjusted the splint, and wrapped the makeshift bandage. Her tongue peeked out slightly between her lips in concentration, and when she finally tied the last knot, she let out a soft sigh. The sparrow gave a tentative flap, wobbled, then stilled. Emily smiled faintly, relief softening her features. She eased the bird back into the hutch, her small fingers lingering on its feathers for a moment, before she closed the door. Samuel stepped forward, his boots crunching over the dirt. "Good hands," he said simply. His voice was gravel, worn, but sure. Emily looked up at him, her green eyes catching the fading light. "You think it'll live?" He crouched beside her, his knee cracking in protest. He studied the sparrow for a moment before answering. "It has a chance. That's what you gave it." He placed a hand on her shoulder, firm but gentle. "That's all any of us can do." Emily nodded, her expression serious, far older than her 9 years. Shadow moved closer then, pressing his side against her back, as though adding his own silent approval. She leaned into him unconsciously, her fingers curling into the thick fur at his neck. Samuel's gaze softened. He saw the way she sought the dog's steadiness, how Shadow had become more than a companion. He was a fortress she trusted, a presence that turned loneliness into something bearable. He had worried once that the bond might make her more fragile, tethering her too tightly to something that could be lost. But watching them together now, he realized it did the opposite. It gave her strength. "You know," Samuel said after a pause, "you remind me of your mother. She was like this too, always finding the broken things, always trying to fix them." His voice caught for a fraction of a second, then steadied. "Guess it runs in the blood." Emily lowered her head, not sure how to answer. The loss still lived close to her skin, a wound that never quite scabbed over. But she didn't cry. Instead, she tightened her grip on Shadow's fur and whispered, "Then I'll keep trying too." Samuel studied her in silence, pride and sorrow mingling in his chest. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "That's all I ask, Em. Just keep trying, no matter how hard it gets." The sun had begun its slow descent by then, the desert sky bruising into shades of purple and gold. Shadows stretched long across the yard, and the neon glow from the gas station down the road flickered faintly against the horizon. The desert wind carried the scent of creosote, dry and sharp. Samuel rose slowly, his back stiff, and turned toward the house. "Come on," he said, his tone lighter now. "Let's wash up. I'll make us some tea before the night gets cold." Emily lingered a moment longer, watching the sparrow, her hand still resting on Shadow's head. The German shepherd looked up at her, with eyes that seemed to understand more than words ever could. She bent down, pressed her forehead briefly against his, and whispered, "We'll keep trying, won't we?" Shadow's tail tapped once against the ground. Inside, Samuel filled the kettle and set it on the old stove, listening to the faint scrape of Emily's boots as she followed, Shadow's paws padding softly behind her. He glanced once at the window, at the horizon where the land fell away into dust and silence. He had lived long enough to know the desert kept its own secrets. And though he didn't yet sense it, that night, those secrets were already beginning to stir. The desert evening came on like a slow exhale. The heat of the day still lingered in the air, clinging to walls and rooftops, but the sharp edge of dusk was already cutting through it. Light bled across the horizon in shades of copper and rose, the sky vast and endless, as though it might swallow the little town of Silverton Hollow whole. Emily sat on the porch steps, knees tucked up, sketchbook balanced on her lap. Her pencil moved in quiet arcs, capturing the silhouette of the mesquite trees against the fading sky. She didn't draw the way most children did, bright colors and smiling faces. Instead, she drew the desert as it was, raw, brittle, beautiful in its silence. Each stroke of graphite mapped the shadows, the long stretches of emptiness, the bones of a land that didn't forgive. Shadow lay a few feet away, his body sprawled in the cooling dust. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, but his ears twitched with every shift in the wind. He was never truly asleep. Even now, as the sun dipped lower and cicadas began their chorus, he was listening, watching. Inside the house, Samuel Walker hummed faintly as he tidied the kitchen, the kettle hissing on the stove. The sound was faint, muffled by walls, leaving Emily and Shadow cocooned in the thin veil of desert dusk. Then it changed. It began with a flicker in Shadow's posture, subtle but immediate. His ears pricked forward, rigid, his head lifted, nose angled toward the horizon, the muscles in his shoulders tightening like bowstrings. His amber eyes sharpened, narrowing at a point far beyond Emily's sight. Emily noticed instantly. She always did. Her pencil stilled against the paper, her gaze sliding from her sketch to the dog. "Shadow?" she whispered. The German Shepherd didn't move toward her. Instead, he let out a low growl, not aggressive, but alert. The kind of sound that came from deep in his chest, a vibration more than a noise. His nose lifted higher, testing the air, drawing in scents carried on the faint desert breeze. Emily set her sketchbook aside, her stomach tightening. She had seen Shadow react to coyotes before, even to storms, but this felt different. His entire body seemed strung with urgency, as if some invisible signal had reached him from miles away. The growl deepened, then cut off. Shadow barked once, sharp and commanding, his voice carrying across the yard and into the empty street beyond. Emily flinched at the suddenness of it, her heartbeat quickening. "What is it?" she asked again, her voice small. But Shadow didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the far horizon, where the jagged outline of the old rusted cross bridge stood like a scar against the fading light. He paced once, back and forth along the edge of the porch, then barked again, louder this time. Emily rose to her feet, brushing dust from her jeans. "I don't see anything," she murmured, her gaze straining toward the same horizon. Nothing moved there, only heat lines shimmering, only the skeletal silhouette of the bridge. Shadow turned toward her then, his eyes catching hers. It was only a glance, but it felt like a plea, a message passed in silence. Then, without hesitation, he bolted. Emily gasped as he lunged toward the fence, powerful shoulders propelling him forward. The chicken wire panel rattled under his weight, and he forced his way through the section she had forgotten to latch earlier that afternoon. In a breath, he was gone, paws striking dust, body a streak of sable and black moving straight toward the open desert. "Shadow!" Her voice cracked as she stumbled off the porch. "Wait!" But he didn't stop. His gait was imperfect, a faint limp betraying the old wound in his leg, yet his speed was relentless. His body moved with purpose, as though some mission buried deep in his bones had been awakened again. Emily's chest tightened. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't play. She felt it in her gut, the same way she always trusted Shadow's instincts. Something was wrong. She hesitated only a heartbeat before she turned back toward the house. Her grandfather's old medic satchel sat in the hallway closet, leather cracked, straps frayed from years of use. Samuel had kept it after the war, filling it with bandages, gauze, thermal packs, and tools he used when patching animals. It was heavy for her, but Emily grabbed it anyway, slinging it over her small shoulder. Her breath came fast, chest heaving, not from exertion, but from the pull of urgency. She grabbed a flashlight from the shelf, her denim jacket from the hook by the door, and bolted into the yard. The desert stretched before her, vast and indifferent. The last traces of sunlight bled away, leaving the land draped in shadows. The outline of Rusted Cross loomed far in the distance, black against the bruised sky. Emily paused only once, glancing back at the glow of the house. Samuel was inside, unaware. A part of her wanted to call for him, to run back and explain, but another part, the part that remembered his lessons, kept her moving. Fear is a wound. Patch it. Don't let it bleed. The words echoed in her mind as she tightened her grip on the satchel strap. Shadow was already a dark speck racing ahead, his body a blur against the fading desert light. She set her jaw, forcing her legs to move, boots kicking up small clouds of red dust. Her heart pounded, her breath caught, but she didn't stop. Whatever had been called to Shadow was real, and she knew it with the same certainty she knew the desert sky. He had never failed her. She wouldn't fail him now. The wind rose, cool and sharp, carrying with it the faint creak of the bridge in the distance. The horizon darkened, stars beginning to pierce the sky. Emily's shadow stretched long behind her as she chased the only thing in her life she trusted more than herself. Toward Rusted Cross. toward the unknown, toward a night that would change everything. The desert night did not welcome children. It pressed against Emily Walker from every side, cold and endless, as though the land itself wanted to turn her back. Each breath burned her lungs with icy air, every gust of wind carrying grit that stung her cheeks and forced her eyes to squint. She gripped the strap of her grandfather's old medic satchel tighter, her small frame bent against the chill. Ahead of her, the only guide was Shadow's trail. His paw prints dotted the sand in uneven but determined strides, pressed deep where his weight shifted against his injured leg. They led her away from the faint lights of Silverton Hollow, away from the fragile safety of home, and toward the skeletal outline that dominated the horizon, Rusted Cross. Even from a distance, the bridge looked alive in the moonlight, its jagged girders rising against the sky like bones of some long-dead beast. The metal groaned faintly as the wind slid through it, a hollow moan that carried across the ravine. Emily shivered, not just from the cold. The bridge looked older than time itself, and yet tonight it seemed to wait, holding secrets in its shadowed belly. Her boots slipped on loose gravel as she descended a shallow slope, knees scraping against stone. She stumbled once, catching herself with one hand before rising again. Her flashlight beam wavered over the sand, catching glimpses of Shadow's tracks. Her heart pounded in rhythm with her steps. "Shadow," she whispered, though her voice was quickly stolen by the wind. Above her the stars were cruelly bright. They glittered like broken glass, scattered across the black sky, sharp and cold. They had no warmth, no mercy. Emily felt small beneath them, a speck of dust in a universe that would not pause if she disappeared tonight. Still, she kept moving. Each step was a battle against exhaustion, but the urgency that lived in Shadow's bark earlier now pulsed inside her like a second heartbeat. Something was wrong. Something was waiting at Rusted Cross. At last, the ground leveled, and she found herself standing at the edge of the ravine. The bridge loomed overhead, a dark skeleton against the heavens. The air beneath it was colder still, shadows pooling like water. She froze, her breath visible in quick, uneven puffs. For a moment she wanted to turn back, to run for home and bury herself under blankets while Shadow returned in his own time. But she couldn't. Not now. The silence was broken by a sound, soft, low, almost a whimper. Emily's heart skipped. She swung her flashlight beam down the ravine floor. The light wavered across jagged rocks and brittle sagebrush before landing on movement. A shape, then two, then three. Her breath caught. Shadow was there, his body pressed firmly against the chest of a man who lay sprawled in the dirt. The German shepherd's fur bristled, his eyes sharp and alert, yet there was a tremor in the way he leaned, half guarding, half giving warmth. His breath rose in quick white puffs as he shifted closer to the man, nudging him with his snout as though to keep him tethered to life. The flashlight trembled in Emily's hand as she drew closer. The man was enormous compared to her, broad-shouldered, dressed in torn fatigues, his face pale beneath streaks of blood and dirt. A cloth gag was tied across his mouth, his eyes half-lidded, unfocused. His left leg was dark with blood, a wide stain spreading through the fabric of his pants. Emily's small hands tightened on the strap of her satchel. Her throat felt dry, words refusing to form. She had never seen so much blood before. Her first instinct was to step back, to retreat from the enormity of what lay before her. But then Nathan Cole's eyes flickered. They opened halfway, glassy but searching. Their gazes met. For a moment, the world around her fell silent. The stars, the wind, even the groaning bridge above. All of it faded beneath the weight of that connection. Emily saw the plea in his eyes, raw and unspoken, and she understood it without words. He was dying. He needed her. Shadow let out a low whine, his body shifting as though to urge her forward. Emily forced her feet to move, her boots crunching on gravel as she knelt beside them. The smell hit her then, iron and sweat, sharp enough to make her stomach lurch. She swallowed hard and reached out with trembling fingers. Her hand hovered near Nathan's face, unsure. Then she touched his cheek gently, testing for warmth. His skin was cold, clammy. Nathan made a sound behind the gag, broken, barely audible. But Emily heard it as clearly as if he had spoken aloud. "Help us." Her flashlight beam swung wider, catching two more figures in the shadows, both bound, both still. One shivered faintly, his gag muffling low groans. The other barely moved at all. Emily's breath quickened. 3 of them. 3 soldiers, left to die under the rusted cross. Her small fingers tightened on the satchel strap again. Every lesson her grandfather had given her, the countless afternoons spent wrapping bandages on practice dummies, the lectures about steady breathing, flashed in her mind. Shadow pressed closer to Nathan, his body vibrating with urgency. Emily understood. She could not freeze. Not now. She dropped the flashlight onto the dirt, its beam rolling sideways to light the ravine wall. Then she pulled the medic satchel off her shoulder and set it down. The zipper rattled under her hands. Her pulse roared in her ears, but beneath it, she whispered the words Samuel had always told her. "Fear is a wound. Patch it. Don't let it bleed." Her hands stopped trembling. Emily looked back at Shadow, who held his position like a soldier on duty, his eyes locked on hers. She gave the faintest nod. "I'll help him," she whispered. "I'll help all of them." And in that moment, beneath the skeletal giant of Rusted Cross, a child and a scarred dog stood at the edge of something larger than either of them could yet understand. The beam of Emily's flashlight lay tilted on the dirt, casting a thin slice of light across the ravine. It illuminated fragments only, Nathan's torn uniform, the jagged steel above, the shimmer of blood on the ground. The rest was swallowed by darkness, a living thing that pressed against her as she knelt. Her hands shook as she opened the medic satchel. The zipper rasped too loud, every sound amplified by the silence of the desert night. Bandages, gauze rolls, scissors, alcohol wipes, her grandfather's careful packing over the years. She froze for a moment, staring at them, her small chest rising and falling in quick bursts. The weight of it was enormous. She was 9 years old. These men were soldiers. How could she be the one to save them? Then Samuel's voice echoed in memory, steady and gravelly. "Fear is a wound. Patch it. Don't let it bleed." Emily swallowed hard and steadied her breath. She forced her hands to slow, her fingers curling around the scissors. Nathan's eyes fluttered open again, glassy and rimmed with exhaustion. He groaned softly behind the gag, his breath ragged. Emily shifted closer, lowering herself to his side. "It's okay," she whispered, though her voice wavered. "I'm here. I'll help you." She slid the scissors against the nylon cord binding his wrists. The blades scraped, biting at the fibers. Nathan's body twitched as she worked, his muscles jerking involuntarily. "Hold still," Emily murmured. Her hands pressed harder, sawing. The cord resisted, cutting into her palm where it pressed. Then, with a sharp snap, it gave way. Nathan's arms slumped forward, limp with exhaustion. Emily caught one wrist and felt for a pulse the way Samuel had taught her. Her fingers pressed gently against the skin. Faint, weak, but there. Relief rippled through her, and she whispered, "Still here. You're still here." She turned to his leg next. The fabric of his fatigues was soaked through, sticky and dark. Her breath caught at the sight of it, but she forced herself not to flinch. She remembered Samuel's lesson, kneeling beside her weeks ago as he patched a stray dog's wound. Don't stare at the blood, Em. Stare at the skin around it. Blood makes you panic. Skin tells you the truth. Emily tore the fabric wider with the scissors, exposing the gash. The edges were jagged, the bleeding slowed but not stopped. She unrolled gauze, her hands trembling only slightly now. She pressed it against the wound, her small palms holding steady. Nathan hissed through his gag, his body stiffening, but she kept the pressure firm. "You have to stay awake," she whispered, her voice urgent. "Please, just stay." Beside her, Shadow moved. The shepherd padded across the dirt, his nose pressing against Ryan Carter, who lay motionless. Shadow sniffed, then began gnawing at the cords around Ryan's wrists, his teeth grinding against the plastic. When the ties refused to yield, he growled low, his jaws working harder. His body trembled with the effort, but he did not stop. Emily glanced at him, the sight both grounding and strange. Her dog, a soldier once himself, working as though he understood exactly what had to be done. "Good boy," she whispered, though her eyes stayed on Nathan's wound. A sudden groan pulled her attention. Ethan Morales stirred, his chest rising sharply as he tried to turn. Shadow moved quickly to him, abandoning the cords for a moment. The dog pressed his snout against Ethan's cheek, licking at the bruises there. The young Marine's eyes fluttered, his head shifting weakly. Shadow licked again, insistent, nudging until Ethan groaned louder, a sound that meant he was still tethered to consciousness. Emily's throat tightened. The sight of it, the bond, the wordless persistence, lit something inside her. They weren't alone in this. She wasn't alone. She pulled fresh gauze from the satchel, her small fingers working carefully to wrap Nathan's leg. The bandage slid awkwardly at first, but she adjusted, remembering Samuel's hands guiding hers once. Not too tight, not too loose, pressure steady, like your breath. She whispered the words to herself, repeating them until the knot held firm. Nathan's breathing steadied slightly. His eyes blinked open again, cloudy but fixed on her. She saw gratitude there, raw and heavy, and it nearly broke her. Her chest rose and fell too fast, her body trembling with adrenaline. She wiped her forehead with the back of her sleeve, smearing dust and sweat. The desert air felt colder now, cutting against her damp skin. She wanted to cry, to let the enormity of it collapse over her. But Shadow barked once, sharp and commanding, and she snapped back into focus. She crawled toward Ethan next, her flashlight beam catching his swollen eye. She pressed her fingers against his wrist, counting the beats. Sluggish, but there. She brushed his forehead with the cloth from her satchel, cleaning the dried blood. His lips moved faintly, but no words came. "It's okay," she whispered again. Her voice cracked this time, but she forced strength into it. "You're going to be okay. Shadow's here. I'm here." Shadow returned to Ryan, tugging once more at the cords, his teeth scraping. Emily crawled beside him, pulling the pocket knife from the satchel. Her hands were clumsy on the handle, but determination steadied her. She sawed at the cords, the nylon biting into her fingers as she worked. Finally, with another sharp snap, they gave way. Ryan's arms slumped heavily to the ground. Emily pressed her fingers to his neck. For a moment, nothing. Then, faint, almost ghostly, a pulse. Relief hit her so hard, she nearly sobbed. "He's alive," she breathed, brushing hair from his bruised face. Shadow nosed at Ryan's chest, then looked back at her with eyes burning in the flashlight glow. It was as if he was telling her, "Keep going. Don't stop." Emily nodded. "I won't." The night deepened around them. The stars glittered sharp and cold, the bridge above them groaning as if in warning. The desert was no place for children, no place for miracles. And yet here, beneath its rusted bones, a child and her scarred dog moved like soldiers in the shadows, patching wounds, keeping breath steady, binding lives to the edge of survival. Emily's hands were raw, her palms burning from the nylon cords and the steady pressure of holding gauze against wounds far larger than her small frame should ever have faced. The ravine air was brittle now, each breath a stab of cold, and her denim jacket did little to keep it from seeping through to her bones. She sat back on her heels, chest rising in shallow bursts, her flashlight beam sliding unevenly across the Marines. Nathan Cole lay nearest her, half-conscious, his chest moving in uneven pulls. The makeshift bandage around his thigh was already darkening, the gauze soaking through faster than she could replace it. His arms, now free of the cords, twitched as if searching for strength that wasn't there. His face, angular and carved by years of sun, looked hollow in the dim light, yet his eyes fought to open, blinking against the shadows until they found hers. He rasped something through the gag, a word she couldn't catch. Emily leaned closer, her small hand resting lightly on his chest. "I don't understand," she whispered. Nathan's head shifted, his gaze sliding down toward his boot. Then, with a faint movement of his fingers, he tapped it weakly against the dirt. Once, twice. His eyes fixed on her, willing her to understand. Emily frowned, then followed his gaze. The boot was scuffed, the leather cracked from years of wear. She had seen plenty like it. Her grandfather had old pairs stacked by the door, worn through at the soles. But something about the way Nathan's heel caught the light made her pause. Carefully, she tugged at the laces. They were stiff, caked with dirt, but after fumbling with frozen fingers, she managed to work them loose. Nathan winced as she shifted the boot, but he didn't resist. Emily pulled it free, setting it in her lap. Her flashlight beam skated across the sole, catching something odd, a seam, barely visible, but there. Her heart quickened. She reached for her grandfather's pocket knife, its handle worn smooth from decades of use. Pressing the tip against the seam, she worked carefully, prying at the edge. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a faint click, the heel compartment shifted and gave way. Inside, wrapped in layers of foil and tape, was a small object, a USB drive. Emily's breath caught. She stared at it, bewildered, the tiny piece of plastic and metal somehow more unnerving than the blood and wounds around her. She turned back to Nathan. His lips moved again, his voice no more than a rasp. This time, she heard it. Proof. The word shivered out of him, weak but certain. Emily's eyes widened. Proof of what? She looked at the USB in her hand again, her mind racing. Samuel had told her stories, in the quiet after her parents died, about men who carried secrets, evidence tucked away in places no one would think to search. But this wasn't just survival. This was something bigger. Nathan coughed, the sound wet, his breath catching. Names, operations. He swallowed hard, eyes closing for a moment, before forcing them open again. Cartel. They'll come back. Emily felt the weight of his words press against her chest. This wasn't just 3 soldiers caught in a trap. This was a chain stretching farther than she could see, a shadow spreading beyond the desert. The drive in her palm was more dangerous than any weapon she had ever imagined. Her small hands closed around it instinctively, hiding it in her fist. She slipped it into the pocket of her jacket, tucking it deep as though the darkness itself might try to snatch it away. Shadow padded closer, his body brushing against her shoulder. His eyes, golden in the flashlight's glow, locked on hers. He seemed to sense it, the shift, the moment when everything changed. Emily leaned into him, her cheek brushing his fur. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "We can't leave them here." The words were not just for Shadow. They were a vow, spoken into the silence, a line drawn against the enormity of the night. She was only a child, small against the bones of Rusted Cross. But in that moment, she carried something far greater than her years. The certainty that walking away was no longer an option. Her fingers brushed the satchel, her grandfather's lessons echoing in her mind. Fear is a wound. Patch it. Don't let it bleed. She looked back at Nathan, at Ethan groaning faintly in the dirt, at Ryan's shallow, uneven breaths. The stars above glittered sharp as knives, the desert stretching vast and merciless. But she tightened her jaw, her small frame braced against the cold. "We'll save them," she murmured to Shadow, "no matter what." The dog's tail tapped once against the dirt, quiet but resolute. And beneath the skeletal bridge, with death pressing close and proof of a cartel empire tucked into her jacket pocket, Emily Walker chose her path. The desert night deepened into something cruel. The cold was no longer just an edge against the skin. It had teeth, biting into bone, sinking into joints, wrapping its claws around lungs until every breath stung. Emily could feel it, even through her denim jacket, the chill gnawing at her arms, her legs, the tips of her fingers. But she wasn't thinking of herself. 3 soldiers lay sprawled in the dirt beneath the skeleton of Rusted Cross. Nathan, closest to her, had slipped into a fitful, half-conscious state, groaning whenever the wind pressed too sharp against his wounds. Ethan Morales, stirred only when Shadow nudged at him, and Ryan Carter's shallow breathing worried Emily most of all. It came in thin, fragile threads, like a candle flame threatened by every gust of wind. Emily's chest rose and fell too fast. Panic hovered, ready to swallow her if she gave it the smallest opening. She had to push it down. She had to remember her grandfather's voice. Fear is a wound. Patch it. Don't let it bleed. She tore at the zipper of her satchel with clumsy fingers, pulling out one of the thermal packs. Samuel had shown her how to use them dozens of times. Snap the seal. Shake it. Heat will come. Simple science, but life-saving. Her thumb pressed until the chemical barrier cracked with a faint pop. She shook it hard, the cold plastic growing warm in her palm. She slid it beneath Nathan's jacket, tucking it against his ribs where the blood loss had stolen most of his heat. "Stay with me," she whispered, leaning close, her voice trembling but urgent. "Don't let go. You're not alone." Shadow shifted beside her, pressing his solid body against Nathan's side. The German shepherd's ears twitched constantly, listening for sounds in the darkness. Every shift of the wind, every groan of the bridge above. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, his warmth seeping into the marine as though he knew exactly what was needed. His tail stayed low, his eyes burning gold in the flashlight's glow. Emily shrugged off her denim jacket next. She draped it across Ryan's chest, then pulled another thermal pack from the satchel. Her hands shook so hard she nearly dropped it, but she clenched her teeth, snapped the seal, and pressed it against his throat and underarm, the way Samuel had taught her. Heat where blood flows closest to the skin. Keep the body core alive. Ryan's face was pale, streaked with dirt and blood. His lips were blue at the edges. Emily leaned over him, brushing her small fingers across his brow. He didn't stir. Fear clawed up her throat, but she forced it down again. She turned to Ethan. His gag muffled faint groans, his eyes swollen, nearly shut. Emily pulled the cloth from his mouth carefully, setting it aside. His lips were cracked, bleeding at the corners. She took the last of her water bottle, dampened a rag, and touched it gently to his mouth. He made a faint sound, half relief, half pain. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. Emily's heart lurched. She leaned close, speaking softly, her words tumbling out like a lifeline. "It's okay. You're going to be okay. I need you to stay awake. Do you hear me? Just stay." She searched for something else, anything to keep him tethered. A story. Samuel always said stories could hold people in place when the body tried to drift away. So she began, her voice soft against the howling wind. "My mom used to tell me this story when I couldn't sleep," she whispered, more to herself than him. "She said the stars are lanterns, carried by people who came before us. Every night they walk across the sky so we won't be scared in the dark. She told me if I ever felt alone, I should pick one and pretend it was her, holding it just for me." Her voice cracked. She blinked fast, forcing the tears back. "I still do that sometimes. I think one of them is hers. Maybe the brightest one. Maybe she's carrying it right now. And maybe one of those lights is for you too." Ethan's lips moved faintly, his breath catching. She leaned closer, straining to hear. "Don't. Stop," he rasped, barely audible. Emily felt her chest tighten. She nodded quickly. "I won't. I'll keep talking." So she did. She told him about the sparrow she had bandaged the week before, about Shadow chasing rabbits through the brush, about how she used to run barefoot in the morning so she could feel the cool sand before it turned too hot to touch. Her words wove together into a thread, pulling Ethan back each time his eyelids sank too low. Shadow barked once, low and sharp, scanning the horizon. Emily's heart leapt, but no danger appeared. The dog settled again, pressing himself harder against Nathan's side, his warmth steady. Emily pressed her forehead briefly against her knees, her small shoulders shaking. She was exhausted, cold, terrified, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't. When she lifted her head again, the stars above seemed sharper, crueler. They glittered like glass, unblinking. But for the first time, she didn't feel entirely crushed by their indifference. She had something they couldn't take from her: resolve. She looked at the three soldiers, broken, bleeding, abandoned, and whispered, "I'll hold the line until help comes. I promise." Shadow lifted his head at her words, his ears flicking. His tail tapped once, slow but steady, against the dirt. And beneath the iron bones of Rusted Cross, a 9-year-old girl and a scarred shepherd stood guard against the desert night, holding a fragile line between life and death. The desert cold pressed in deeper, threading itself through Emily's sleeves, stealing the warmth from her skin. Her small hands were numb, stiff as she reached for the satchel again. The flashlight beam flickered against the rocks, painting the Marines in harsh light and shadow. Faces battered, eyes closed, breaths too shallow. The silence between their groans was the part that terrified her most. She sat back for a moment, hugging her knees to her chest, and the weight of the night pressed on her like a stone. She could feel fear climbing inside her throat, thick and heavy, threatening to choke her. It would be so easy to stop, to curl into herself, to let the cold and the darkness swallow everything. And that's when it came back to her. The night of the accident. She had been in the back seat, clutching her sketchbook, when the tires screamed and metal twisted around them. She remembered the smell of smoke, the sudden quiet after the crash, the broken glass sparkling in the headlights like 1,000 tiny stars. She had crawled out, knees bleeding, ears ringing. Her parents had been so close, her mother's hair falling across the dashboard, her father's hand slack against the steering wheel. Emily had stood there, frozen. The world had narrowed to the pounding in her chest, the sound of her own breathing too loud. She had seen them, seen the blood, seen their stillness, and she had done nothing. She hadn't screamed for help. She hadn't touched them. She had stood in the desert night, a child made of stone, until strangers pulled her away. The guilt of it had followed her like a shadow, whispering that when it mattered most, she had failed. Now, staring at the Marines sprawled beneath Rusted Cross, she felt that same panic clawing again. Her breath quickened, her throat tight. She pressed her forehead into her knees, squeezing her eyes shut, tears burning hot despite the cold. Not again, she thought. Her fists clenched tight around her knees. Not this time. She lifted her head sharply, inhaling hard, steadying herself the way Samuel had taught her. Fear is a wound. Patch it. Don't let it bleed. Her small jaw tightened. Not again, she whispered aloud, the words torn from her chest. This time, I won't run. She turned back toward Ryan Carter. His lips were cracked and pale, his breath shallow, almost lost to the night. Emily reached into the satchel for the water bottle. Only a few sips left. She hesitated, her throat dry as paper, but she forced herself not to think of her own thirst. She tore a strip from one of the clean cloths, dampened it, and pressed it gently to Ryan's lips. At first, nothing. Then his throat moved faintly. A reflexive swallow. Emily leaned closer, her eyes wide, whispering encouragement. That's it. Just a little. You have to stay. She tilted the cloth again, careful not to spill. Each drop mattered. Each tiny trickle of water across his lips felt like an anchor pulling him back from the edge. Shadow padded to her side, lowering his head until his snout touched Ryan's chest. His ears twitched, catching every faint sound of breath. Emily reached out with one hand, stroking the shepherd's neck, drawing strength from the solidity of him. We'll keep him here, she murmured. We won't let him go. Her mind echoed with Samuel's lessons. Nights at the kitchen table when he made her practice rolling bandages. Afternoons when he taught her to breathe through fear by counting the beats of her own pulse. He had never coddled her. He had treated her like someone capable, someone who could learn. And now, with the desert pressing close, those lessons were the only thing keeping her hands steady. She dabbed Ryan's lips again, then checked his pulse at his neck, just as she had with Nathan. It was weak, but it was there. She exhaled, her shoulders sagging with fragile relief. The wind rattled the bridge above, its groan echoing down the ravine. Emily looked up, staring at the skeletal iron against the stars. They glittered sharp and cold, like 1,000 watching eyes. For the first time since the accident 2 years ago, she didn't feel paralyzed under their gaze. Instead, she spoke back, her voice quiet but firm. You didn't take them from me so I could fail again, she whispered into the night, as though speaking to her parents, to God, to anyone who might listen. Not this time. Shadow shifted beside her, pressing against her side, his warmth anchoring her to the present. His tail tapped once against the dirt. Emily wiped at her cheeks roughly with the back of her hand. She straightened, shoulders squared, her small figure outlined against the flashlight's beam. Fear was still there, gnawing, but she no longer let it dictate her. She had patched it. She had chosen. She turned to the soldiers again, her voice stronger now. You're going to live, all of you. I don't care how cold it gets. I don't care how long we're out here. I won't let you go." The men didn't answer. They couldn't. But she spoke anyway, filling the silence with her words, with her will. And for the first time in 2 years, Emily Walker wasn't the little girl frozen by loss. She was the one who refused to run. The night had settled into its cruelest hour. The cold was no longer a creeping presence. It was a conqueror, seizing every inch of exposed skin, sinking deep into bone. Emily's teeth chattered, despite her efforts to keep still, her fingers stiff as she rubbed them together for warmth. Around her, the Marines lay like fallen statues, their breaths shallow, their bodies weakening with every moment the desert stole from them. She had done all she could. Bandages were in place, gauze pressed firm, thermal packs tucked against ribs and arms, jackets laid across chests. But the truth pressed against her like the iron bones of the bridge above. It wasn't enough. They needed more. Heat, water, medicine, hands stronger than hers. Her gaze fell on Shadow. The German shepherd stood a few feet away, ears sharp, body tense, his silhouette carved against the faint glow of the stars. His breath puffed white into the air, his eyes catching the beam of her fallen flashlight, turning them into molten amber. He looked like something ancient, a guardian forged from loyalty itself. Emily crawled toward him, her knees grinding against the gravel, until she was close enough to bury her small hands in his fur. His coat was thick beneath her fingers, warm, alive. She pressed her forehead against the side of his neck, closing her eyes for a moment, drinking in his solidity. "Shadow," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They won't make it if it's just us." The shepherd's ears flicked, but he didn't move away. He stayed still, letting her clutch him, letting her words sink into the bond they shared. Emily pulled back, her hands sliding to frame his face. His eyes met hers, burning and steady. She could see herself reflected in them. Small, scared, but stubborn. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I need you to go," she said softly, her voice breaking on the words. "Find help. Bring them here." Shadow blinked once, slowly. He didn't move. His muscles stayed tense, his body refusing the command. He shifted his weight back toward Nathan, leaning closer to the Marine as though to say, "I won't leave him. I won't leave you." Emily's heart clenched. She stroked the scar along his flank, her fingers tracing the story written there. "You've already saved them," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "But I can't do this alone. You know I can't." Her voice rose, pleading now. "Please." "Go." Shadow whined low in his throat, the sound vibrating against her palms. His ears twitched, his tail flicked once. Still, he hesitated. Emily leaned closer, her forehead pressing against his again, their breaths mingling in the frigid air. She forced the words out, steadying them with every ounce of courage she had left. "I'll hold the line, I promise. But you have to bring them here, Shadow. You're the only one who can." Silence stretched between them, heavy and sacred. Then slowly, the shepherd shifted. His head turned toward the ridge beyond the ravine, ears pricked, nose testing the wind. His body quivered, torn between instinct to guard and command to leave. Emily's hands slipped from his fur, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "Go," she said again, firmer this time. Her voice cracked on the single word, but she didn't look away. "Find help." Shadow held her gaze one moment longer. Then, with a sharp breath, he turned. His muscles bunched, his body launched forward. Gravel skittered beneath his paws as he scrambled up the slope. Emily scrambled to her feet, following a few steps, her voice tearing out of her throat. "Go, Shadow, please!" The shepherd reached the top of the ravine and paused, his silhouette framed against the star-splattered sky. He looked back once, ears tall, eyes gleaming. Their gazes met across the distance, child and dog, a silent vow passing between them. Then he bolted. His body blurred into the darkness, paws drumming against the sand, his limp noticeable, but not slowing him. He disappeared into the vast, merciless desert, swallowed by blackness and starlight. Emily stood frozen, her breath ragged, tears streaking down her cold cheeks. The silence that followed his departure was deafening. The ravine felt emptier without him, the weight of responsibility pressing harder onto her small shoulders. She turned back to the Marines, their breaths shallow, their bodies fragile against the cold. She sank to her knees again, pulling Nathan's jacket tighter around him, brushing Ethan's face with the damp cloth to keep him tethered, whispering softly to Ryan, though he could not respond. Her voice wavered, but she spoke anyway, because silence meant surrender. "He'll come back. He'll bring help. We just have to hold on." Above them, the stars glittered sharp as glass. The bridge groaned in the wind. And Emily Walker, 9 years old, sat in the shadows of Rusted Cross with 3 dying soldiers, clutching faith like it was the only weapon she had left. The desert opened before him, black and endless, silence broken only by the pounding of his paws. Shadow ran. Each stride jarred his old wound, fire burning through scarred muscle. But he did not falter. Pain was an old companion. Tonight, urgency mattered more. Dust lifted behind him, gravel cut into his pads, his breath steamed into the freezing night. Above, the stars burned sharp, watching him as he crossed the ravine and into scrubland. His heart echoed a single command: run, don't stop. Shadow knew this land. Trails, scents, forgotten patrols, all guided him toward the ridge. But deeper than instinct, memory drove him. The field, the gunfire, the voice of handlers barking commands. And now, Emily's whisper. Go find help. He pushed harder. His limp worsened, climbing the slope, rocks sliding under him. He snarled, fought upward, then hurled himself forward. Scrub bushes twisted like hands. Cacti stood as sentinels, and his shadow stretched long against the sand. Each stride recalled a whistle, an order, the urgency of saving lives. Tonight there was no leash, only a child's trust. At last, a scent, rusted iron, oil, electric hum. Ahead lay Echo Post, the relic he remembered from training, where the siren box had once screamed across the desert. That was where he must go. The rise loomed steep, his body shaking. He stumbled, fell hard, sand filling his mouth. For a moment, the dark whispered surrender. But Shadow growled and rose again, each step tearing him forward until at last the plateau leveled beneath him. Echo Post stood silent. Concrete walls scarred and crumbling, glass shards clinging to rusted frames, a bent antenna clawing at the sky. The place was a husk, forgotten. But Shadow remembered. He pushed through the cracked threshold, past dust and relics of another war. And there it was, the siren box, dull red, rope dangling like a lifeline. Shadow crept forward, trembling. Emily's voice rose again in memory. "You're the only one who can." He reared onto his hind legs, jaws clamping on the rope. Once, nothing. Again, dust fell, but silence remained. Pain seared through him, but failure was not an option. He lunged, teeth tearing at the rope. With a violent jerk, it gave. The siren screamed. At first broken, then rising into a shrill, relentless wail. It tore across the desert like a blade, echoing off ridges and canyons, carrying farther than any cry for help could. Shadow dropped to the floor, sides heaving, listening to the howl. Not a drill, a call for life. He curled beneath the doorway, body wrecked, eyes on the horizon. The siren wailed on, and miles away, in Silverton Hollow, people stirred. Samuel Walker jolted upright in his chair, tea spilling as the sound shattered the silence. Only one dog had ever been trained for that rope. "Shadow," he whispered. He grabbed his jacket, bolted for his truck. Sheriff Dean Whitaker froze at his desk, the pen slipping from his hand. He hadn't heard that wail in a decade. Static filled his radio. No accident, no false alarm. Someone was alive, desperate. "Hold on," he muttered, snatching his keys. Across town, Rachel Monroe shot upright on her couch. The rescue chief had been a rookie the last time the siren was pulled. This wail carried urgency. She grabbed her boots, her dog whining at the door. "Not you, boy. This one's for Shadow." Within minutes, her truck roared down the highway. Engines lit up the night. Samuel's battered pickup, the sheriff's cruiser, Rachel's rescue truck. Dust spiraled in their headlights as each driver tore toward the sound. To Samuel, it was his granddaughter's heartbeat. To Rachel, a call to arms. To the sheriff, a demand for justice. The siren bound them together. A cry dragged from a scarred shepherd's teeth. And as dawn broke faint across the desert, its wail carried one message clear: help is coming. The truck jolted hard as its tires slammed into a rut, bouncing Samuel and Rachel against their seatbelts. Headlights cut sharp across the desert, chasing shadows over ridges and dry washes. The siren howled in the distance, shrill, relentless, the only compass they needed. Samuel's hands locked white around the wheel. Every bump rattled his bones, but he didn't ease off the gas. The old pickup roared forward, engine growling like it shared his urgency. Beside him, Rachel gripped the handle above the window, bracing against the violent swerves. Dust streamed behind them in pale clouds, swallowed by black. Her voice was steady, but certain. "She's out there, isn't she?" Samuel didn't answer at first. In his mind he saw Emily. Her braids loose, her jaw set, dwarfed by the desert. And Shadow, running like the soldier he had once been. His throat tightened. "I should have stopped her. I should have kept her inside." Rachel glanced at him, her features hard in the dashboard's glow. "Sam, you raised that girl to see wounds and patch them, not to turn away. You couldn't chain her to the porch, not Emily." His grip on the wheel tightened. "She's 9 years old, Rachel." 9, out there with men bleeding under that bridge because I wasn't watching close enough. His words cracked. The only sound left was the rattling engine and the endless scream of the siren. Rachel let it hang a beat, then spoke low but firm. "You think she ran because you failed. I think she ran because she's yours." He shot her a look. She held his gaze. "She's got your blood, Sam. The same blood that pulled men out of firefights when you were bleeding yourself. You taught her to move toward pain, not away. That's not failure. That's a legacy. His chest tightened. Images rose unbidden. Emily at the kitchen table, rolling bandages with clumsy hands. Emily patching a sparrow's wing. Emily whispering, "I don't want to be afraid anymore, Grandpa." His voice was hoarse. "I was supposed to protect her." Rachel reached over, steady hand on his arm. "Maybe this time she's protecting someone else." The words cut deep because they rang true. Samuel blinked hard, clearing his eyes, staring at the jagged outline of rusted cross against the star-splattered sky. The siren wailed louder now. They were close. Rachel checked her watch. If Shadow pulled that rope, he's running on memory. That means Emily's with them. Her silence left the rest unsaid. Emily had stepped into something larger than herself. Samuel's voice hardened. "Then God help the men who thought they could bury soldiers under my desert." The truck hit another ridge, bouncing hard. Dust swallowed the headlights, then cleared. Rusted cross loomed closer, a skeleton of steel in the dark. "Almost there," Rachel murmured. Samuel pressed harder on the gas. "Hold on, Em. Just a little longer." Beneath the bridge, the night had grown colder, crueler. Frost bit Emily's ears and fingers as she knelt beside Jesse Morales, her knees grinding into frozen dirt. The flashlight in her trembling hand flickered weakly against the ravine walls. Jesse's chest rose shallow, each breath slower than the last. Emily pressed her fingers to his neck the way her grandfather had shown her. For a terrifying moment she felt nothing. Then, a faint, faltering pulse. "No," she whispered fiercely. "You're still here." She clasped his limp hand between her own, squeezing tight as tears slid hot down her cheeks. "You're not alone. Please stay." Her voice cracked, carried off by the desert wind. Jesse didn't stir. His eyelids fluttered, but never opened. Panic clawed at her chest. She pressed her forehead to his knuckles, whispering again and again, "Don't go. Please don't go." Nearby, Nathan groaned faintly. Ryan stirred with a broken sound, but Jesse lay frighteningly still. Emily clung to his hand as though she could tether him to the world. She was too small, too cold, too alone, until a sound broke the silence. Gravel shifting, a low, familiar huff of breath. "Shadow," she whispered. Out of the darkness he came, limping, chest heaving, his coat dusted with sand. His flank was torn where his old wound had reopened, but his eyes burned fiercely and gold. "Shadow!" Emily gasped, sobbing as she threw her arms around him. His fur was cold, solid, real. He leaned into her briefly, then pulled free to circle the Marines, sniffing, checking. "Did you do it? Did they hear?" she whispered. Shadow didn't answer, but his ears snapped toward the ridge. Emily froze. Headlights, faint beams crested the ridge, bouncing as trucks tore across the path. Engines hummed, tires crunched against gravel. Dust rose like halos in the beams. Her chest tightened with disbelief and hope sharp as pain. "They're coming," she whispered. Tears blurred her vision. She squeezed Jesse's hand. "Do you hear that? Help is here. Just hold on." Shadow pressed against her side, tail flicking once. He seemed to know what the lights meant, that his journey had bought them this chance. The ravine erupted in sound. Engines roared, doors slammed, voices shouted. Floodlights snapped on, pouring white beams into the canyon. Emily shielded her eyes, blinking against the glare. For so long there had been only silence, broken breathing, and whispered prayers. Now, movement, urgency, life. Ropes dropped from the ridge. Figures descended fast, harnesses clicking, medpacks strapped to their backs. Rachel Monroe hit the ground first, her voice cutting sharp above the chaos. "Thermal wraps here. Check vitals. Start triage." She sprinted to Jesse. dropping to her knees with practiced precision. Gloved fingers pressed his throat. Pulse weak, but he's here. Warming packs now. Relief buckled Emily's chest. She let the paramedic slip a blanket beneath Jessie's arm, her tears spilling faster as Rachel's calm voice filled the ravine with order. And then, "Emily!" Her head snapped up. A clumsy figure stumbled down the slope, slower than the rest, his beard catching the floodlight. Samuel. "Grandpa!" Emily bolted across the dirt, colliding into his chest. His arms wrapped around her fiercely, crushing, as though he could drag her back into safety by sheer force. Samuel's breath shuddered. "Thank God. You're safe. You're safe." Emily sobbed against him. "I couldn't leave them. They were dying, Grandpa. I had to stay." His throat worked as he pulled back, cupping her face. Her cheeks were streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes burned steady, too old for her years. Pride and terror split his heart. Behind them, Shadow limped forward, sides heaving. Samuel's gaze softened. "Good boy," he whispered hoarsely. "You brought us here." The shepherd didn't linger. He pressed back against Nathan's side as medics worked. Nathan stirred faintly, eyes fluttering open. His bruised mouth cracked a faint smile. "Good dog," he rasped, fingers brushing Shadow's fur, before slipping back into unconsciousness. Emily's vision blurred. The words felt like a benediction, fragile hope in the chaos. Shadow lowered his head, pressing against Nathan as if to promise he wouldn't leave. Rachel's voice rose again, steady and commanding. "Tourniquet here. Oxygen mask now. Keep him conscious." Floodlights swung wider as more rescuers poured in. Thermal blankets spread. IV lines connected. Vitals shouted. Within minutes, the ravine transformed into a field hospital, urgency replacing despair. Emily clung to Samuel's jacket, watching with wide eyes. "They were so cold," she whispered. "I didn't know if they'd make it." Samuel pressed a rough kiss to her hair. "Because of you, they will. You did your part, Em. More than your part." The siren at Echo Post had gone silent, its cry fading into memory. In its place came the roar of generators, the shuffle of boots, the clipped urgency of voices. But beneath it all, Emily still heard her own heartbeat and the vow she had whispered into the darkness. "Not again. I won't run." Now, in her grandfather's arms, with Shadow at her side and soldiers being lifted back from the edge, she knew she hadn't. For the first time since the night of the accident, Emily Walker believed she had saved someone. By dawn, Silverton Hollow was no longer the quiet desert town it had been the night before. Its heartbeat had shifted to the hum of generators and the shuffle of boots. The community center, once home to bingo nights and town meetings, was now a triage unit. Canvas dividers split the basketball court into wards. Folding tables were pushed aside for medical cots. Nurses moved briskly under buzzing fluorescent lights. Oxygen tanks hissed and clipped orders carried across the hall. 3 cots stood in the center beneath heated lamps. Nathan Cole, Ethan Morales, and Ryan Carter lay wrapped in thermal blankets, IV lines running into their arms. Faces, pale but alive. Rachel Monroe worked tirelessly nearby, her jacket tossed over a chair, sweat dampening her hair. "Increase fluids. Raise Carter's core temp another degree. Don't let Cole move that leg." Her calm authority steadied the chaos. In the corner sat Emily Walker, slumped in a folding chair too big for her frame. Her braids were frayed, her jeans streaked with dirt and dried blood. She stared at the cots, her hands clenched together as though in prayer. At her feet lay Shadow. The shepherd's chest rose slow and heavy, his scarred leg trembling from his desperate run. His eyes never strayed from Emily or the men. From time to time, Her small hand slipped into his fur. Neither needed words. Samuel paced nearby, boots still dusty, his beard damp from washing away tears. He crouched beside her chair, voice soft. "You need to rest, Em. They're in good hands now." Her eyes didn't move from the Marines. "What if they wake up and I'm not here?" Samuel swallowed hard. "Then they'll know you stayed as long as you could." "I promised them," she whispered. "And you kept it," he said gently. His rough hand squeezed hers. "More than anyone could ask." Shadow stirred at his voice. Samuel stroked his ear. "You too, boy. You did what none of us could." For a time, only the rhythm of work filled the hall, the hiss of oxygen, the shuffle of shoes, the faint beeping of monitors. Emily's eyes lifted when Nathan stirred faintly, lips moving. A nurse adjusted his mask, but Emily swore she heard one broken syllable. "Dog." Her gaze dropped to Shadow. A fragile smile touched her lips. "He knows. He remembers." For the first time since the bridge, she leaned back against the chair, her hands still tangled in Shadow's fur, her body surrendering at last. The doors opened. Sheriff Dean Whitaker strode in, a laptop under his arm, his face lined with urgency. He set it on a table and unwrapped a small object, Nathan's hidden USB drive. Rachel and Samuel gathered close. Emily leaned forward, her exhaustion cracking under the tension. Whitaker plugged it in. Files filled the screen, rows of documents, maps traced with red, payment trails, signatures. Rachel exhaled. "Good Lord." Whitaker's jaw tightened. "This isn't just smuggling routes. These are payment trails, shell companies, bank accounts, names." His finger tapped the screen. "Real people, running this from both sides of the border." Rachel leaned closer. "That's cartel intel. High level, enough to dismantle half their operation." Whitaker clicked another folder. Images of trucks on mining roads, GPS coordinates, and files labeled simply, "Cargo." Samuel's voice was low. "What kind of cargo?" Whitaker's voice hardened. "Not just weapons, not just drugs. They were moving people." The weight hit the room like a hammer. Nurses still. Even the generator hum seemed quieter. Emily's small voice broke the silence. "They hid it. Nathan told me it was proof. They tried to bury it with him." Whitaker's gaze softened briefly, then he straightened. His voice rose, carrying through the ward. "This little girl and this dog didn't just save 3 soldiers. They brought us what we needed to break this wide open." Samuel's hand settled proudly on Emily's shoulder. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching, as if he knew his work was named in the sheriff's words. Whitaker closed the laptop with finality. "I'll forward this to federal task forces before the hour's up. Make no mistake. We didn't just stumble onto a rescue. We stumbled onto a war. And thanks to them, we just won the first battle." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Emily sat frozen, her hand on Shadow's head, dwarfed by the moment. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired, scared, but inside her, something warm flickered. Hope. The doors burst open again. Daniel Walker stormed in, Gillian close behind. His eyes were red-rimmed, his voice raw. "Emily Walker, what in God's name were you thinking?" His boots struck the floor like gunfire. "You snuck out in the middle of the night. You could have died." Emily froze, tears brimming. Her hand clenched Shadow's fur. "I couldn't leave them," she whispered. "You're 9 years old. It's not your job." A gravelly voice cut him off. "It was her job tonight." Samuel stepped forward, shoulders heavy, but eyes blazing. "Don't lay your anger on her. She remembered everything I taught her. She didn't freeze. She didn't run. She stayed. And because she stayed, 3 men are breathing." Daniel faltered, anger draining under the weight of the truth. His eyes shifted to Emily, her dirt-streaked cheeks, trembling shoulders, exhaustion too old for her age. A child who had carried more than most men. He knelt, his hands shaking as they found hers. His voice cracked. "Emily, I was scared when I thought you were gone. I didn't know if I could survive losing you too." Her breath hitched. She leaned forward into his chest. "I'm sorry, Daddy, but I couldn't let them die." His arms closed around her fiercely. "No, sweetheart. I'm sorry. I should have trusted you." Samuel exhaled slowly, the steel easing from his posture. Gillian pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling. Shadow thumped his tail once, as if sealing the moment. Around them, the triage continued. Doctors stitching, nurses adjusting IVs. But something else had been mended here, something deeper than wounds. Emily let her father's heartbeat steady her. For the first time since the desert night began, she allowed herself to rest. The fight wasn't over. The files had made that clear. But in this hall of light and determination, with her father's arms around her, her grandfather standing guard, and Shadow curled at her feet, Emily Walker finally believed she was safe. And Daniel, holding her as though she was the only thing keeping him alive, knew there was no anger left, only gratitude, only love. The desert did not sleep. At dawn, its silence was broken by engines growling across forgotten mining roads. Sheriff Dean Whitaker's convoy snaked through the canyons, dust rising like pale ghosts. Red and blue patrol lights pulsed against rock walls. Every deputy who could carry a rifle had been called. County reinforcements rolled in grim and ready. The USB drive had given them everything. Drop sites hidden behind mines. Caches disguised as sheds, GPS trails tucked into false permits. For years, Whitaker had buried unsolved files. This time, the answers were in hand, and they'd come from a little girl and her dog. "Quarter mile," a deputy muttered. Whitaker lifted his radio. "All units prepare to breach. Quiet, sharp, no mistakes." The convoy slowed. Ahead lay rusted sheds and trailers, relics of a mining camp. Except now they were cartel hubs. Boots hit the dirt, doors slammed. Deputies fanned out, rifles raised. The first shed cracked open, crates of weapons stacked to the ceiling, rifles, belts of ammunition, even rocket launchers. The second yielded falsified permits, forged mining schedules. Rachel Monroe flipped through a binder. They were running this right under the state's nose. The third shed froze them. Behind a padlocked cage huddled 7 captives. 3 men, 2 women, 2 children. Pale, bruised, their eyes wide with terror. "Sheriff!" Whitaker strode in. For a heartbeat he froze, the years carved into his face deepening. These weren't statistics. These were the missing persons reports that had haunted his desk. "You're safe now," he said, voice steady. "We're here to take you home." Bolt cutters snapped, blankets wrapped around trembling shoulders. The children were lifted gently into rescuers' arms. A woman sobbed into a deputy's chest, her body convulsing with relief. Outside, the sun spilled gold across Blackstone Quarry, revealing weapons catalogued, captives escorted to ambulances, evidence bagged. Rachel dumped ledgers onto a patrol hood. Names, routes, even politicians. "This isn't local, Dean. It's national." Whitaker scanned the pages, jaw tight. "And now it's over." He keyed his radio. "All units, Operation complete. Evidence secured. Captives safe. The words were more than a report. They were a promise fulfilled. Nathan, Ethan, Ryan had nearly died for this truth. Emily and Shadow had carried it home. Now the chain was broken. For the first time in decades, Whitaker felt the desert wasn't just a graveyard of secrets. It was a battlefield where the innocent had won. By midday, Silverton Hollow's story was no longer its own. What began as a siren echoing over ridges became headlines flashing nationwide. 9-year-old girl and dog crack smuggling ring. Child hero, K9 expose cartel network. From desert silence to national headlines. Reporters swarmed the town. Vans lined the streets, satellite dishes tilted skyward, anchors delivering the miracle in practiced tones. Inside the community center, the triage continued, nurses tending Marines under heated lamps, but the air now buzzed with cameras and questions. Emily sat curled in her folding chair, Shadow's head heavy across her boots. She stroked the ridge of his old scar absently. Around her, people whispered her name. The girl who stayed. The girl who found the proof. A reporter crouched with a microphone. "Emily, how did you know where to go?" Her mouth opened, then closed. The noise, the lights, it was too much. She pressed her face into Shadow's fur. His warm breath steadied her. His tail flicked once, as if to shield her. Samuel stepped forward, his frame a wall. "That's enough. She's not a headline. She's a child." His voice carried steel. The reporters quieted. Across the room, Whitaker faced the press with steadiness. Yes, a girl and her dog cracked this case. But this wasn't luck. It was courage. They stood where most adults would have run. Because of that, lives were saved. Rachel added softly, "Silverton Hollow will be remembered. Not for tragedy, but for hope." The words traveled far, but Emily heard only the hush of Shadow's breathing. She hadn't gone into the desert to be a headline. She had gone because Shadow ran, and 3 men were dying. That was all. Samuel crouched beside her. "Let the world talk, Em. You just rest." Emily whispered against Shadow's fur. "As long as you're here, I don't care what they say." That night, the center quieted. Reporters were pushed outside, their cameras fading into the hum of generators. Nurses moved slower now, checking vitals. Emily still refused to leave her chair. Shadow lay sprawled across her boots, his breathing even. She wasn't sure if she was keeping watch for the Marines or for herself, afraid silence might swallow them again. Then Nathan stirred. His eyes opened, gaunt but clear, and found her across the room. Slowly, he lifted a hand, beckoning. Emily slid off her chair, padding across the floor, suddenly shy. Up close, he looked older, scarred, carved by duty. "You stayed," he rasped. "I promised," she whispered. His hand trembled upward. She clasped it in hers, her small fingers engulfed in his calloused grip. "I didn't think anyone would find us," he said. It was Shadow. He knew. The shepherd's golden gaze fixed on him, tail tapping once against the floor. Nathan smiled faintly. "Then both of you." He tugged weakly at the chain around his neck. The dog tags clinked as he pulled them free, pressing them into her palm. Emily's eyes widened. "But those are yours." "Not anymore," he said hoarsely. "For courage under fire." Her lip trembled. "I'm just a kid." Nathan shook his head. "No, you're the reason I'm still here. That makes you family to every man who wears these." Tears blurred her vision. She curled her hand tight around the tags. I'll keep them safe. I know you will. His eyes closed again, the smile lingering faintly. Emily stood frozen, the weight of the tags heavy in her hand. Shadow nosed her elbow gently, grounding her. She sank beside him, pressing into his warm side, listening to the steady thump of his heart. He thinks we're heroes, she whispered. Shadow's tail tapped again, slow and certain. We didn't run. That was enough. For the first time since the sirens split the night, Emily let her eyes close. The desert outside still stretched mercilessly and wide, but here, under the glow of lamps, with dog tags clutched in her palm and Shadow keeping watch, she finally slept. The courthouse in Silverton Hollow had not seen this many people in years. Its sandstone steps, worn smooth by desert winds, were swept clean that morning. Paper banners, painted by children with clumsy brushstrokes, fluttered overhead. They read words like courage and thank you, the letters uneven but alive with sincerity. Families crowded the square. Parents lifted children onto shoulders. Elderly neighbors leaned on canes, nodding with pride. For once, the little town that always seemed forgotten was the center of attention. At the base of the courthouse steps, rows of folding chairs filled with faces the town had nearly lost. Nathan Cole, Ethan Morales, and Ryan Carter sat in the front row. Uniforms pressed, posture straight, scars still fresh. Nathan's leg was braced, Ethan's face still bruised, Ryan's hands trembling faintly when he clapped. But they were alive. Behind them stood the deputies in crisp tan uniforms. Rachel Monroe, usually sharp and commanding, moved briskly between volunteers, her expression softened by a rare smile. And in the second row, squeezed between Samuel and Gillian, sat Emily. Her braids were neat, her jacket clean, but her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. Around her neck dangled Nathan's dog tags, catching the sun each time she shifted. At her feet lay Shadow, his coat brushed, his new collar embossed with polished silver. Rescue Unit, Honorary. His amber gaze swept the crowd, tail thumping whenever Emily's hand brushed his head. Sheriff Dean Whitaker stepped to the podium. For years he had stood before this community only to deliver bad news, missing persons, unsolved cases. Today was different. Good folks of Silverton Hollow, his voice carried across the square. We gather here not because tragedy struck, but because courage answered. He gestured toward the Marines. These men were taken from us, bound beneath an old bridge, left to die. Every chance said we would never see them again. But we do, because of two unlikely rescuers. His hand swept toward Emily and Shadow. All eyes followed. Emily's cheeks burned. She wanted to hide in Shadow's fur, but Samuel's hand on her shoulder kept her steady. Shadow lifted his head proudly, tail wagging. Whitaker's voice deepened. A little girl who refused to leave, a dog who refused to give up. Together, they saved not only 3 soldiers, but gave us the proof to tear down a network that had haunted this desert for years. The applause erupted, loud, rolling, thunderous. People rose to their feet, children waved banners, whistles pierced the hot air. Nathan rose slowly on his cane, turned and saluted Emily, not with stiff duty, but with gratitude. Emily's throat tightened. She gripped the tags at her chest. Samuel leaned close. That's for you, Em. Don't hide from it. She lifted her chin, still trembling, but her eyes steady. Whitaker raised his hand. Silence fell again. He opened a velvet box and drew out a gleaming silver medal. Youth Valor Award, engraved with a compass. Emily Walker, he called. Come forward. Her stomach fluttered. Her legs shook as she climbed the steps, each footfall echoing. Shadow watched, ears pricked, as Samuel whispered, "Go on, sweetheart." At the podium, Whitaker bent to meet her eyes. "For extraordinary courage, for saving lives when all hope was gone, we present you with the Youth Valor Medal." He slipped the ribbon over her head. The medal settled heavy and cool against her chest. The square erupted again. Cheers, whistles, applause that seemed to shake the sandstone walls. The Marines saluted from the front row, their hands trembling but unwavering. Emily touched the compass medal with trembling fingers. Her eyes darted down the steps to Shadow. He sat proudly, tail swishing once as if in approval. Rachel Monroe stepped forward, holding another medallion. This one was larger, shaped like a paw, strung on a red ribbon. She knelt before Shadow. "And for loyalty beyond measure, for bravery that put even some of us to shame, we honor Shadow as an honorary rescue dog of Silverton Hollow." She draped it around his neck. Laughter and cheers rippled through the square as Emily hurried down to kneel beside him, stroking his fur. Shadow gave a low chuff, ears flicking at the ribbon, but his tail wagged steady. Samuel pressed a hand discreetly to his eyes, wiping quickly, though Gillian caught it and held his hand tight. To the crowd, his tears weren't weakness, they were truth. On the courthouse steps, Emily whispered into Shadow's ear, "It's yours, too." "We did it together." He pressed his head against her shoulder, tail tapping softly, a rhythm of agreement. Whitaker's voice rose once more. "Remember these names, Emily Walker, Shadow. Because when the desert is silent again and the dust has covered our tracks, their names will still echo. Courage isn't about size or strength. It's about refusing to leave when others would run." The applause swelled again, rolling across the square and out into the ridges, as if the desert itself needed to hear. Later, when the square had emptied and volunteers stacked chairs, Emily remained on the steps with Shadow at her side. She touched the medal on her chest, the compass engraving gleaming in the sun. She leaned down, whispering, "We did it, boy." Shadow studied her face, then pressed his head against her shoulder. His amber eyes lifted to the horizon where Rusted Cross still stood, skeletal against the sky. Emily followed his gaze. "It feels different now," she whispered. "Like the desert isn't empty anymore." His tail tapped gently, agreeing. Behind them, Samuel lingered, silent, watching his granddaughter with quiet awe. She fingered Nathan's tags, remembering his words, "For courage under fire." She pressed her forehead to Shadow's and whispered, "No one will forget you. Not ever." Shadow's breath warmed her cheek, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon, listening to sounds only he could hear. As the last sunlight slid behind the ridges, Emily felt the desert differently. No longer cruel, no longer empty. A place that now carried voices, of survival, of promises kept, of paw prints pressed into dust that would never fade. She smiled, small, but real. "We did it, boy," she whispered again. And in the silence that followed, it felt like the desert itself agreed. Silverton Hollow had always been a place where the desert swallowed ambition. Dreams withered like dry grass, and people lived quietly, grateful just to endure. But in the weeks after Rusted Cross, the town felt different. The silence still lingered, but so did momentum. The courthouse square clattered with hammers and plans. At the edge of town, near an old fire training yard, fresh fences rose, wooden posts, chain link, and a sign waiting to be hung. Red Hollow K9 Rescue Unit. Rachel Monroe had sparked the idea, but now it belonged to everyone. Retired deputies donated gear, ranchers hauled scrap for obstacles, schoolchildren painted paw prints on plywood. For the first time in years, Silverton Hollow was building something together. At its center was Shadow. The shepherd padded through the half-finished course with quiet authority, his limp still visible, but his head high. He sniffed tunnels, climbed ramps, paused at hurdles. Every movement is deliberate. He wasn't a trainee. He was the foundation. Emily was always there. Her schoolbooks sat forgotten in her backpack as she ran beside him, braids fraying in the wind. She sketched the course in a notebook Samuel had given her, whispered encouragement into Shadow's ear, and stayed long after the other kids went home, hauling buckets, sweeping sand, carrying cones. Nathan Cole, still recovering, became her steady guide. Leaning on his cane, he taught her quietly how to map by starlight, find water, steady her breathing when fear pressed close. Treat fear like a wound, he told her. Patch it, clean it, keep moving. Don't let it fester. Emily wrote the words carefully, not realizing until later that her grandfather had said nearly the same thing. Truth sounded heavier when spoken by two men she trusted. Shadow often trained alongside them, responding to old military commands Nathan remembered from embedded K9 units. He wove through cones, froze on command, leapt low barriers despite his limp. And when he faltered, Emily steadied him with a touch. The town gathered at the fence to watch. They didn't see a child and her dog anymore. They saw a beginning, a promise that the desert would not always belong to shadows, but to guardians who would not run. One evening, Nathan pressed a scratched field compass into Emily's hands. "You'll need this," he said quietly. "Not just out here, in here." He tapped her chest. "When the world tilts, when you feel lost, this will keep you steady." Emily's fingers curled around the cool metal. "Like a promise?" "Like a guide," Nathan said. "You already know how to follow your instincts. This just helps when the stars aren't enough." Shadow's tail swept the dirt, as if to agree. Emily looked at the compass, at Nathan, at the shepherd at her side. She felt the weight of the desert, but not as fear, as direction. "This is only the beginning," she whispered. Shadow barked once, steady and low, as if the future had heard. That future returned her to Rusted Cross. At dusk, Emily sat cross-legged on a boulder above the ravine, denim jacket tight against the chill. Shadow sprawled across her lap, his amber eyes half-lidded, but ears twitching toward every groan of the old bridge below. Nathan stood nearby, steady against his cane, the Marine's face lit by the last glow of sun. For a long while, silence reigned, only the whisper of wind and the cry of a hawk. Finally, Nathan spoke. "People think catching the bad guys means it's over, that the world goes quiet. It doesn't. They wait, they change, they come back with different faces." Emily's eyes lifted, solemn. "So, it's never really over?" He lowered himself onto the rock beside her, slow but deliberate. "Not completely. But what you and Shadow did, you broke their chain. That matters. It saves lives." Emily's hand traced Shadow's collar. "But I was scared. I almost froze. Like when my parents—" Her throat closed, but she forced the words. "I didn't want to lose them too. I didn't want to just stand there again." Nathan nodded, eyes dark with understanding. "Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about standing up while your knees shake. You didn't run." Shadow's warm breath against her palm echoed the words. Emily smiled faintly. I think Shadow knew. He never stopped. Dogs don't care about odds, Nathan said. They care about loyalty. Who needs them? That's why we trust them with our lives. Sometimes they remind us how to be brave. The sky deepened purple. Emily leaned into Shadow's fur, her voice soft. Maybe faith is like that. You don't always see it. You don't always feel strong. But it stays, even in the silence. Nathan studied her, as if hearing echoes of soldiers he once served with. You've got more faith than most grown men I know. Don't lose it. Emily gazed toward the horizon. The jagged outline of Rusted Cross glowed dark against the sky. Once it had been only despair. Now it looked like a monument. We broke their chain, she whispered. Shadow's ears pricked. Nathan's hand settled on her shoulder. Yes, he said firmly. And no one can take that away. They stayed until the stars pierced the dark sky. A girl, a soldier, and a dog, bound not by blood, but by survival, faith, and quiet courage. Later, Emily sat again on the overlook. Shadow stretched at her side, his paw medallion catching the last streaks of twilight. The desert below glowed rust and gold, the ridges of the quarry sharp against the fading light. She stroked his scarred fur gently. We did it, boy. Shadow lifted his head, amber eyes steady, and pressed against her shoulder. No words were needed. His gaze said it all. Yes, we did. She smiled, trembling, but real. Her mind flickered with memories. The Marines alive, the courthouse applause, Whitaker's voice booming, Nathan's compass in her hand. And through it all, Shadow, his paws pounding gravel, his bark under the bridge, his warmth beside her when fear threatened to win. The stars pricked through the velvet sky. Emily leaned her forehead against his, whispering, No one will forget you, Shadow. Not ever. The shepherd exhaled, his tail brushing the stone, his gaze locked on the horizon. The narrator's voice closed the circle softly, like a prayer. Sometimes God's miracles don't roar. Sometimes they walk quietly, on 4 legs, beside a child who refuses to give up. In the silence of a desert night, where death pressed close, hope came instead, not with trumpets or thunder, but with paw prints in the dust and the steady heart of a little girl who chose to stay. Because of that, lives were saved, chains were broken, and a town remembered what faith can still do. Emily let her eyes close. Nathan's tags pressed to her chest, Shadow's steady heartbeat against her cheek. The desert was quiet again, not cruel, not empty. A quiet that felt like resilience. And as the night wrapped Silverton Hollow, the girl and her dog sat side by side, silhouettes against a horizon that no longer felt empty. And because sometimes the smallest voices and the softest steps echo the loudest in the heart of the world. Sometimes the most powerful reminders of love don't come in words, but in the quiet presence of a loyal dog. Stories like Emily and Shadow's touch us, because they show what so many of us already know in our hearts. German shepherds, and dogs in general, carry a kind of devotion that goes beyond training. They stand beside us in silence, comfort us when we're weak, and remind us that loyalty can be both fierce and gentle. If you've ever felt that bond with your own dog, you know it's something sacred. And if you're looking for ways to deepen that connection, there are some wonderful resources out there. Guides, communities, even simple tips that can make each day with your companion more meaningful. I've found one I keep coming back to, and I'll leave the link below in case it speaks to you too. Take a look if you'd like. Or just take this as a gentle reminder to give your dog an extra scratch behind the ears tonight. Sometimes that's all they're asking for. And sometimes it's all we need. We